I do have a lot to say, so I'm just going to crack on quite quickly. So, as we'll discuss in detail this week, securing access to adequate quantities of effective FMD vaccines is challenging, particularly in endemic settings where vaccination can often form a critical component of FMD control. We know that as global FMD control progresses, as the livestock industries of the world are increasing in numbers, and as export markets between endemic countries are emerging, this demand is likely to increase. So in many settings, national veterinary services have very limited budgets for animal disease control, and increasingly these are being directed towards public health challenges. We also know that foreign aid budgets are limited and often sporadic in nature. But in contrast, there is mounting evidence to suggest that livestock owners, particularly of cattle, may have the economic resources to afford vaccination and therefore represent a large potential market. However, there are numerous supply and demand barriers that prevent this market from functioning, and so a theoretical unmet demand exists. Understanding the scale of this demand in the endemic setting is an essential step towards addressing these barriers and achieving global vaccine security. So that was just to set the scene for you, but essentially in this presentation I will provide a quick overview and update on work that's currently ongoing to begin to undertake and consider the questions: what quantities of vaccine are we currently using? What is the unmet demand for vaccine? For instance, in a theoretical case of unlimited supply, how much would we use? And how might these needs change over time? So our objective in this work is not to predict the precise number of vaccines that we might need, but rather to use future trends to start a conversation between this group of colleagues about the scale of the problem so that together we can ensure that we are able to continue to support the progressive control of FMD. So, how many vaccines are we using? A 2011 estimate based on the number of doses produced estimated annual use of around 2.3 billion doses globally, 70% of which we produced and used in China. And work is ongoing to update these figures, and I'm sure the number of you in this room could help to tighten up some of these figures in the 2017-18 column. But the official data suggests that trends are reasonably similar from 2011 to now. However, if we remove the big players from the calculations, we're presented with a very different picture of vaccine use in the rest of the world. The rest of Asia, Africa, and the Mid-East, areas that are key for the endemic circulation of FMD, are only accessing at best around 7% of vaccine supplies. Yet over 20% of the world's small and large ruminant populations reside here, and projections suggest this is going to increase significantly. So over the last few decades, the global livestock sector has been growing at an unprecedented rate, faster than any other agricultural sector. Earlier this month, the FAO released a Future of Food and Agriculture Alternative Pathways to 2050 report, which represents a huge body of work by the Global Perspective Studies team to forecast projected trends in agricultural sectors, including livestock populations. This data is available online, and it basically presents us with a likely range of growth in global livestock populations. So this graph summarises some of that information, and it shows that we might expect, if we were to continue in a business as usual scenario, that the world's population of FMD susceptible livestock would increase by 40% by 2050. That's over 1.2 billion pigs, 2.4 billion large ruminants, and 3.5 billion small ruminants. But not only that, the vast majority of this increase is occurring in the regions we can consider key for endemic circulation of FMD. So the largest expansion by far is going to potentially occur in sub-Saharan Africa, with an average increase that translates to around triple the pig population and double the small ruminant and large ruminant populations by 2050. What this means is that we can expect a very significant increase in the at-risk population in regions where FMD is endemic. How might this influence the burden of disease in these endemic countries? What are the implications for free countries with transboundary virus movements? And are we prepared? The current global vaccine levels would suggest not. So this is really an issue that affects everyone, both FMD-free and endemic countries. And not just from a disease control perspective, but from a food security and livelihoods perspective as well. An example is that by 2030, the world's human population will reach around 8.5 billion and global dairy production will increase by around 33%. So you can see that several FMD endemic countries will become big players in the dairy industry. And in fact, India, with an annual increase in herd size of around 2.5%, is predicted to overtake the EU in milk production by 2030. So around the same time, India will become the world's most populous country, and that population is heavily reliant on dairy products. So how will our future livestock industries manage the production risks associated with FMD without access to adequate volumes of effective FMD vaccine? Perhaps the first step towards addressing this issue is to consider the question, how many vaccines will we need? So let's consider the global FMD situation in 2018. The large ruminant population in non-FMD-free countries is estimated to exceed 940 million, which we already heard from Keith this morning. And if we exclude China, who report to vaccinate the national large ruminant herd twice annually, then we're looking at an at-risk population of around 800 million large ruminants. So there are around 72 countries who have a validated stage along the PCP for FMD. And during regional roadmap meetings, countries map their annual progression through these stages and forecast where they would like to be by 2025. And by making these forecasts, each country demonstrates a commitment to progressing FMD control through the stepwise control activities, which we all know about in detail, I'm sure. So the global FMD strategy aims to support countries in the lower stages to achieve advancement in 2 stages in the first 15 years. And since 2012, we have been moving in the right direction, but the step from phase 2 to 3 requires development of a national official control program which aims at virus elimination. Now, this is arguably quite difficult without access to effective vaccines in adequate quantities. So how much vaccine do we need to support this, given that the projected increase in global livestock populations, as we discussed? And it's a big and complex question, but I think that we need to start discussing this to develop better projections of growth for demand in our future, to support our future preparedness. So we have the livestock population's projected growth, as I mentioned. We have the forecast progress along the PCP, the stages that countries have committed to achieving by 2025. And if we combine vaccination surveys done at regional roadmap meetings, reported vaccination coverage from the OAE-WAHIS database and expert opinion, we can start to formulate estimates of coverage, regional specific coverage, that would be required to support this. And then we can start to estimate the regional vaccination coverage estimates to produce future trends that look something like this. So this is just a quick and simple example to visualize this data that's stratified by FMD pool. I've put up the first 6 pools, where the blue line indicates the projected livestock populations by million head, and the orange line shows an estimate of the volumes of vaccine needed to support the PCP targets of the countries that are participating in the PCP. And that's stated in million cattle equivalent doses. So these graphs are based on a number of assumptions, and here we see that all susceptible livestock species are included, which would perhaps not necessarily be a priority for all regions. So we can start to adapt the data from something basic like this into something a little bit more regionally specific. And perhaps I just wanted to show you that this breakdown, as it's interesting to look at the difference in trends between the different pools. Particularly, you can see deepness of the orange line in some of the areas that are lower on the PCP and have the highest projected growth of livestock into the future. So we can start to keep in mind where vaccine production is occurring and what antigens are being produced when we start to look into the future. And perhaps breaking the data down by FMD pool gives us an opportunity to use this risk-based framework when considering the types of FMD antigens we might need in the future. So, thank you. So acknowledging these assumptions that there are some limitations, what if we stratify by species and exclude the big players? So perhaps we're most interested in large ruminants as that's generally the population for priority for vaccination in most regions. And if we exclude China as its large ruminant population is vaccinated, then we can see that the countries that have a strong commitment to FMD progression based on the orange line. And this estimate suggests that to support these countries to achieve that progress, we'll need to be able to support an increase in use from 250 million to almost 1 billion cattle equivalent doses by 2025. And that's obviously in the regions that we're discussing that have lower vaccine rates currently. So the key messages from this is, I guess, collectively, some significant advances have been made in the progressive control of FMD in recent years. However, continued progress of countries committed to achieving stage 3 and beyond of the PCP FMD means that securing access to a reliable supply of vaccines is required. Currently, global vaccine supplies are not tailored to some of the more vulnerable regions of the world who have a high reliance on livestock for their livelihoods and where endemic circulation of FMD is significant. Furthermore, these are the regions predicted to have the highest projected livestock growths. So the at-risk population will increase dramatically. And finally, to continue the progressive control of FMD, the demand for FMD vaccine is projected to rise sharply in the coming years. So meeting this demand is only likely to occur if there is a similar growth in production of appropriate vaccines. My final slide, the way forward. I think as a community we need to start engaging with this issue to understand the drivers for demand and uptake. I think more work is needed to quantify the willingness of producers to pay and context-specific incentives for vaccination. To develop better predictions of growth and demand, for example, can we continue this kind of work to implement a more formal modelling approach? We need to address the barriers to supply. We want to hear from those investing in the we want to hear from those investing in the production of FMD vaccine. Can we summarise the priority barriers for the scientific community here today to collaborate on? And finally, we need to explore novel approaches for vaccine supply. What opportunities do public-private partnerships present, for instance? So regardless of whether you're an academic, a policymaker, a vaccine manufacturer, or livestock producer, I think ultimately we're all working towards the same goal, which is the increased access to vaccines. And for me, global vaccine security means having access to adequate volumes of affordable, accessible, and effective vaccine to support the progressive control of FMD. I believe we do not currently have this, and unless we engage with this issue, I believe we're facing a future of increasing uncertainty for vaccine security. Just wanted to acknowledge the people who contributed as well as the co-authors at the beginning, and I've probably run out of time. Thanks.